wasn't a witness. It wasn't DNA. It wasn't even a confession. It was a search bar. At first, the case made no sense. A brutal murder, no clear suspect, and a crime scene that raised more questions than answers. Investigators followed every lead, but nothing stuck, until they looked somewhere most people never think about. Not in the house, not on the street, but inside a browser. A few words typed late at night, questions no innocent person should be asking. And suddenly, the silence broke, because what someone searches can reveal what they were planning. And in this case, it exposed everything. At first, the case didn't point in any clear direction. It was violent, sudden, and deeply unsettling. The kind of crime that immediately tells investigators this wasn't random, but beyond that, nothing made sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle that spilled across multiple rooms, and no immediate suspect who stood out. Just a scene that felt controlled. That detail alone shifted the investigation early on, because when a crime appears controlled, it often suggests familiarity. Either the victim knew the person responsible, or the person responsible knew exactly how to move without drawing attention. Investigators started with the basics. They mapped the victim's last known movements, spoke to friends, family, co-workers, checked phone records, recent messages, and call logs, everything that could reveal who the victim trusted, or who might have had a reason to get close. But nothing jumped out, no recent threats, no public conflicts, no one acting suspicious enough to justify immediate focus. For a moment, it looked like the case might stall before it even fully began. Then came the deeper dive. When traditional leads run thin, investigators turn to patterns. Behavioral, digital, environmental. They look for anything that doesn't quite fit. And that's when attention shifted to something more subtle: devices. Not just the victims, but the people around them: phones, laptops, tablets. In today's world, almost every action leaves a trace. Messages get stored, locations get logged. Even deleted data often isn't truly gone. It's just hidden beneath layers waiting to be uncovered. So digital forensics teams got involved. They began extracting data, reconstructing timelines, and analyzing activity that on the surface might seem completely ordinary: scrolling, typing, searching. At first, it was just noise. Hundreds of searches, random topics, everyday curiosity. The kind of digital footprint everyone leaves behind without thinking twice. But then, something stood out: a cluster of searches, not spread out over months or years, but concentrated, focused, repeated within a short period of time. And the content of those searches? That's what changed everything. They weren't casual questions. They weren't harmless curiosity. They were specific, uncomfortably specific. Questions about timing, about methods, about outcomes. The kind of questions that don't appear by accident. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions right away. They couldn't afford to. Context matters. A single search can be explained. Even a few might be coincidence. But this wasn't one or two. It was a pattern, a progression. The searches became more direct over time, as if someone was moving from curiosity to intent. And when analysts aligned those search timestamps with the timeline of the crime, the overlap was impossible to ignore. The activity didn't happen weeks before. It didn't happen long after. It happened right around the moment everything changed. That's when the case shifted. What had once been a mystery with no clear direction now had a thread, one that connected digital behavior to real-world action. But a thread isn't proof. Not yet. Investigators needed to go further. They needed to understand who was behind those searches, and whether those digital traces could hold up against everything else they were building. Because if they could, then this wouldn't just be a clue. It would be a window into the mind of the person responsible. Once investigators identified the pattern in those searches, the focus narrowed fast, but carefully. Because here's the thing about digital evidence. It's powerful, but it has to be airtight. Anyone can search anything. Curiosity alone isn't a crime. So the challenge wasn't just what was searched, it was proving who searched it, when, and why it mattered. That's where the deeper forensic work began. The device linked to those searches was examined in detail, not just the visible browsing history, but everything beneath it. Cache data, login sessions, IP activity, even fragments of deleted records that most people assume are gone forever. And what they found removed any remaining doubt. The searches weren't random. They followed a sequence. First, general questions, broad, almost exploratory. Then, more refined searches, focus on specifics. And finally, highly targeted queries that aligned directly with the way the crime had been carried out. It was a progression, a digital trail that showed intent forming step by step. But investigators still needed to tie that device to a person beyond any reasonable doubt, so they cross-referenced everything. Lot land credentials connected the device to a specific user. Location data placed that device in key areas at critical times. Wi-Fi connections showed when and where it had been active. Even typing patterns and timestamps helped establish consistency, showing that the same individual had been using it during those searches. And then came one of the most important moments in the case. When the timeline of those searches was placed side by side with the timeline of the crime, they lined up almost perfectly, each happening hours before, Apney pausing during the estimated time of the crime, and then resuming afterward, with queries that shifted in tone, less about how, and more about what happens next. That shift told investigators something chilling. This wasn't just planning, it was awareness. An understanding that something had already happened, and a need to manage the aftermath. At that point, the digital evidence wasn't just supporting the case, it was driving it. Still, law enforcement moved strategically. They conducted interviews, giving the individual a chance to explain. At first, the responses were controlled, denials, deflections, attempts to distance from the situation. But digital evidence doesn't react, it doesn't forget, and it doesn't change under pressure. Every claim that didn't align with the data only made the picture clearer. Eventually, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. And when the arrest was made, it wasn't based on a single discovery, it was built on layers. Physical evidence, timeline and reconstruction, and at the center of it all, a search history that told the story before anyone else could. What shocked people the most wasn't just that the case was solved, it was how it was solved. Not through a dramatic confession, not through a surprise witness, but through something so ordinary that most people never think twice about it: a search bar, a place where thoughts turn into questions, and questions turn into records. For the victim's family, the outcome meant answers, not perfect closure, because nothing truly replaces what's been lost, but clarity. A truth that could finally be acknowledged instead of questioned. And for everyone else, it left a different kind of impact, a realization that in today's world, actions don't just leave physical traces, they leave digital ones too. Sometimes more detailed, sometimes more honest. Because people might control what they say out loud. What they search? That's often unfiltered. And in this case, that unfiltered trail became the most powerful piece of evidence investigators had. It showed planning, it showed timing, and ultimately, it showed responsibility. The kind that can't be erased with a deleted history or a forgotten password. Because once something is out there, once it's been recorded, it has a way of coming back. And sometimes, it comes back when it matters most. If this story made you think twice about how much our digital lives reveal, about how even the smallest actions can leave a lasting trace, then you're starting to see the bigger picture. Because the truth doesn't always hide in obvious places. Sometimes, it's already written. You just have to know where to look. If you want more real cases, deeper breakdowns, and stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe to the channel, because the next story might already be sitting in someone's search history.